Kang Jae-hyun stepped off his private jet at Le Bourget after 7 months of static. He hadn't slept. He hadn't spoken since the plane crossed the Russian border. The only thing in his mind was the image of Naomi Cole standing at Incheon airport 7 months ago, waving goodbye for a 2-week break. She never came back to finish her program. She never sent the "I landed" text. For 210 days, Jae-hyun had been a ghost in his own empire, turning the Seoul underworld upside down for a lead. He was the head of the Kang Syndicate, a man who controlled the ports of Busan and the boardrooms of Gangnam. He had dismantled rival gangs with a single phone call. He was relentless, efficient, and cold. But for 7 months he had been powerless. He didn't wait for his security to open the door of the black sedan. He walked the rain-slicked streets of the 19th arrondissement alone, a velvet box weighing down his pocket, a ring he'd bought the day she was supposed to return to Korea. He reached the gray, crumbling apartment building. His heart, usually as steady as a predator's, hammered against his ribs. He didn't know that behind that door, Naomi was counting the minutes until her husband came home to continue her nightmare. Before we continue. This story traveled thousands of miles from the neon streets of Seoul to the cold rain of Paris. But I want to know how far it's traveled to reach you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It means the world to me to see where you're listening from. If you're ready for the journey, hit like, subscribe, and let's begin. The rain in Seoul didn't fall so much as it drowned the city in a restless, neon-soaked haze. It was the kind of night where the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, reflecting off the glass towers of Gangnam and the wet pavement of the narrow alleys where secrets were usually traded for blood. But Kang Jae-hyun wasn't in a warehouse or a boardroom tonight. He wasn't overseeing the arrival of a shipment at the Incheon docks or deciding the fate of a rival lieutenant who had skimmed off the top. Tonight, the man they called the Dragon of Gyeonggi stood in a place that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the lingering, ghostly scent of ink. He stood in a university lecture hall on the outskirts of the city, a place of learning and light that felt entirely too fragile for a man of his shadow. The hallway outside was silent, save for the rhythmic, muffled footsteps of 4 men in sharp black suits who stood guard at the entrance. They were statues of muscle and suppressed violence, their presence a jarring contrast to the academic peace of the building. They didn't ask why their boss wanted to visit an empty classroom at 2 in the morning. In Jae-hyun's world, you didn't ask questions. You simply ensured that whatever ground he walked upon was secure. Jae-hyun pushed open the heavy oak door of classroom 402. It creaked, a lonely, high-pitched sound that seemed to echo through the corridors of his own chest. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. The glow from the street lamps outside filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting long skeletal shadows across the rows of wooden desks. He walked slowly, his handmade Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum, a sound like a ticking clock marking the seconds of a life he no longer recognized. He stopped at the 3rd row, 4 seats in from the aisle. This was it. The abandoned desk. 7 months. 210 days. 5,040 hours. Jae-hyun knew the math of her absence by heart. He had lived every second of it as if it were a sentence he had been forced to serve. He reached out, his hand hovering over the scarred wood of the desktop before finally letting his fingers graze the surface. It was cold. It was covered in a thin, microscopic layer of dust that felt like a personal insult to his memory of her. Naomi Cole had sat here. For nearly 18 months of her 2-year international business program, this had been her coordinate in the world. He could still see her, as clearly as if the room were full of students and the sun were high in the sky. He could see the way she would lean her chin on her palm, her dark skin glowing against the pale light of her laptop screen, her brow furrowed in that intense concentration that always made him want to kiss the space between her eyes until she laughed. She would wear her hair up on study days, a messy crown that she'd constantly poke a pencil into, only for it to slide out minutes later. She had been a vibrant, breathing contradiction to his world. While he spent his days navigating the cold, lethal politics of the Kang Syndicate, Naomi spent hers arguing about macroeconomics and the ethics of global trade. She didn't know who he was when they met. Not really. To her, he was just Jae-hyun, the quiet, impeccably dressed man who frequented the same high-end tea house near the university. He had pursued her with the same relentless precision he used to take over territories. But with her, the conquest had turned into a surrender. For the first time in his 34 years, the dragon had found a place to rest his head. And then, she had gone home for the mid-semester break. 2 weeks, Jay, she had whispered against his neck at the airport terminal. The memory hit him now with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the smell of her vanilla perfume, the softness of her beige coat, and the way her hand had lingered in his until the very last possible second. I just need to see my dad, help him with some paperwork for the gallery, and I'll be back before the first lecture of the new term. I promise. She was a woman of her word. Naomi Cole didn't make promises she didn't intend to keep. That was what had fueled the fire in Jae-hyun's gut for 7 months. If she hadn't come back, it wasn't because she didn't want to. It was because something or someone had stopped her. He sat down in the chair behind her desk. It was cramped for a man of his stature, his long legs hitting the underside of the wood. But he didn't care. He wanted to feel the world from her perspective. He looked at the chalkboard, erased clean but still hazy with the ghosts of previous lessons. He imagined her taking notes, her handwriting neat and slanted, occasionally doodling a small dragon in the margins of her notebook, a private joke they shared. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen glowed, illuminating his face. Sharp jawline, tired eyes, a mouth that hadn't truly smiled in half a year. He opened their message thread. He didn't need to scroll. The last message was from him, sent 7 months ago. I'm waiting at the gate. Where are you? It was followed by a string of gray bubbles. Messages that had been delivered but never read. Then, eventually, messages that wouldn't even deliver. Her phone had been disconnected 3 days after she landed in Paris. Her social media had gone dark. It was as if she had stepped off the plane at Charles de Gaulle and walked straight into a void. Jae-hyun had spared no expense. He had sent his best trackers to Paris within the first week. They had found nothing. Her father's gallery was closed, the windows boarded up. Her family home was empty, the utilities shut off. The neighbors said the Coles had moved abroad or to the countryside. Their stories conflicting and vague. It was a professional erasure, the kind of disappearance Jae-hyun himself might have ordered for a witness or a whistleblower. But Naomi was a student. Her father, Ezekiel, was an art dealer. They were civilians. They didn't belong in the world of vanishing acts. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the hard plastic of the chair. The silence of the classroom was heavy, pressing in on his eardrums. In the absence of sound, his mind played back the tapes of the last 7 months. The rage he had unleashed on his men when they returned empty-handed. The way he had systematically dismantled every rival organization in Seoul, half convinced that one of them had kidnapped her to get to him. He had burned through millions of dollars, broken countless bones, and stained his hands darker than they had ever been, all in the name of a woman who might not even know he was looking. But his intuition, the animal instinct that had kept him alive in the syndicate, told him she was still out there. He could feel her pulse in the world, a faint, rhythmic tether that pulled at his soul. He opened his eyes and looked down at the desk again. In the dim light, he noticed something. It was faint, nearly invisible under the dust, but there was a mark on the right corner of the desk. He leaned in closer, his heart beginning to thud with a sudden, irrational hope. It was a small carving, done with the tip of a compass or a pen. It wasn't a dragon. It was a date. The date she was supposed to leave for Paris. And next to it, 2 small letters, J.H. A tremor ran through Jae-hyun's hand. She had carved his initials into this desk before she left. It was a childish, permanent mark of affection, a claim laid in a place of learning. It was her saying she was coming back to him. "Boss!" The voice of Secretary Choi broke the silence. The door had opened a crack, and his right-hand man stood there, his face a mask of professional concern. "The car is ready. We have a meeting with the Busan elders in an hour. We should leave now if we want to avoid the morning traffic." Jae-hyun didn't move. He kept his eyes on those 2 letters, J.H. He realized then that he had been approaching this the wrong way. He had been acting like a king waiting for a subject to return to his palace. He had been sending soldiers to do a seeker's work. He had stayed in Seoul because the empire required his presence, because his pride told him that she would eventually find her way back to the power he held. He was wrong. She wasn't coming back because she was in a cage he couldn't see from across the ocean. "Choi," Jae-hyun said, his voice raspy from hours of silence. "Yes, boss. Cancel the meeting with Busan." Choi paused, his brow twitching. "Sir? The elders have traveled a long way. This merger is—" "I don't care about the merger," Jae-hyun snapped, standing up. The chair screeched against the floor, a violent sound in the quiet room. He stood tall, the shadows wrapping around his black suit like a shroud. "I don't care about the ports, the gold, or the territory. I've spent 7 months ruling a kingdom that feels like a tomb." He walked toward the door, his gaze fixed on some distant point far beyond the walls of the university. As he passed Choi, he didn't stop. "Prepare the jet," Jae-hyun ordered, "and tell the Paris contact to meet me at the hangar. I don't want a team. I don't want a parade. I'm going alone." "To Paris, sir?" Choi asked, hurrying to keep pace with his boss's long, determined strides. "For how long?" Jae-hyun stopped at the end of the hallway, looking out a window at the rain. The Seoul skyline was beautiful, but it was cold. It was a world of glass and steel that offered him everything except the one thing he needed. "As long as it takes," Jae-hyun replied. "I'm going to find her, and when I find the people who kept her from me, I'm going to show them why it was a mistake to let the dragon leave his cave." He stepped out of the building and into the downpour. The rain soaked his hair, running down his face like tears he refused to shed. He didn't shield himself. He welcomed the cold. It was a reminder of the 7 months of winter he had endured, a winter that was about to end in a fire that would burn all the way to France. As the black Mercedes sped away from the university, leaving the abandoned desk behind in the darkness, Kang Jae-hyun looked at the small velvet box he had been carrying in his pocket for 210 days. He hadn't opened it once since the day he bought it. He wouldn't open it now. He would only open it when he could place the ring on her finger. The jet's engines were already warming up by the time they reached the private hangar. The smell of aviation fuel and the roar of the turbines felt like the beginning of a war. Jae-hyun climbed the stairs without looking back. He didn't care what happened to the syndicate while he was gone. He didn't care if his rivals moved in on his territory or if his bank accounts were frozen. Power was a lie if you had no one to share it with. Loyalty was a ghost if the person you loved most was silenced. He sat in the plush leather seat of the cabin, the same cabin where she had once laughed and shared a bottle of champagne with him on a trip to Jeju. He closed his eyes and summoned her face one last time. Not the bruised, tattered version he would soon find, but the radiant Naomi who had carved his name into a desk because she thought they had forever. "I'm coming, Naomi," he whispered into the hum of the cabin. 7 months too late. But I'm coming. The plane lifted off into the stormy Seoul night, banking hard toward the west. Below, the lights of the city began to fade, replaced by the vast, dark expanse of the sea. It was a long flight to Paris. 11 hours of silence. 11 hours to plan. 11 hours for the man who had everything to realize he had nothing to lose. The dragon was no longer waiting. He was hunting. And in a small, cramped apartment in the 19th arrondissement of Paris, a woman who had forgotten how to hope felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She shifted her weight, protecting her heavy stomach, and looked at the rain hitting her window. She didn't know that the world she had left behind was currently flying through the stratosphere at 600 miles per hour, fueled by a rage and a love that not even the Atlantic could extinguish. She didn't know that the silence was about to be broken. Jae-hyun stared out the window of the jet, watching the moon reflect off the clouds. He thought about the desk. He thought about the dust. He thought about the letters J.H. He would find the person who made her leave that desk. He would find the person who made her stop writing her name. And he would make sure that the last thing they ever saw was the face of the man who had come thousands of miles to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood. The journey had begun. The neon of Seoul was gone, and the cold rain of Paris was waiting. And between the two lay a man who had finally realized that his throne was worthless if his queen was in chains. The dragon had left his cave, and the world was about to burn. As the flight attendants moved silently through the cabin, offering drinks he wouldn't touch and food he couldn't eat. Jae-hyun pulled a single, crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was the only lead his trackers had found in the last 48 hours, a blurred photo of a man named Malik Laurent entering a bakery. In the background, barely visible, was a woman in a beige coat. She was pregnant. Jae-hyun's grip on the photo tightened until his knuckles turned white. He didn't know the full story yet. He didn't know about Ezekiel's debts or the marriage of convenience. He didn't know about the bruises or the fear. But he knew that the woman in the photo was his. And he knew that the child she was carrying was his blood. He didn't sleep for the entire 11 hours. He just watched the sun rise over the horizon. A cold, golden light that offered no warmth, only the clarity of a mission. "We are beginning our descent into Paris." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Jae-hyun stood up, adjusting his cuffs and straightening his tie. He looked in the mirror, seeing the predator looking back. The morning was over. The search was finished. "Welcome to Paris, boss," Choi said, appearing at his side with a heavy overcoat. Jae-hyun took the coat, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He stepped toward the exit as the plane touched down on the runway, the wheels screaming against the asphalt. "Let's go," Jae-hyun said. The door opened, and the cold, damp air of France rushed in. It smelled of wet stone and old secrets. Jae-hyun stepped out onto the tarmac, his eyes narrowed against the drizzle. He was home, because wherever she was, that was the only home he had left. The abandoned desk in Seoul was thousands of miles away, a relic of a past life. Ahead of him lay the nightmare of her present. But as Kang Jae-hyun walked toward the waiting car, his heart was a steady, lethal drumbeat. 7 months was a long time. But for a man like him, it was just enough time to build a rage that would last a lifetime. Paris did not greet Kang Jae-hyun with the romantic glow of 1,000 postcards. To him, the city was a labyrinth of gray limestone and damp shadows, a place where the air felt heavy with the scent of diesel and ancient, rotting secrets. He didn't see the Eiffel Tower as a monument to love. He saw it as a cold, iron needle piercing a bruised sky. He hadn't come for the art, the wine, or the history. He had come for a ghost, and he knew that ghosts were usually found in the dark. The 19th arrondissement was a world away from the manicured gardens of the Louvre. Here, the streets were narrow and slick with a permanent oily sheen, and the buildings leaned toward each other like conspirators whispering in the rain. Jae-hyun sat in the back of a nondescript black sedan, his silhouette motionless against the tinted glass. He was a pillar of dark, expensive fabric and suppressed violence. Beside him, Secretary Choi remained silent, his eyes fixed on a crumbling doorway across the street that led down to a basement bar. It was a place where light went to die and where men with nothing left to lose gambled away things they didn't own. "He's been in there for 3 hours, Choi murmured, checking his watch. "Our local contacts say he's lost everything. Again. He's currently trying to put his watch on the table, but the house won't take it. It's a fake." Jae-hyun didn't blink. His gaze was a laser focused on that door. Ezekiel Cole. The man who was supposed to be Naomi's protector. The man who had shared her blood and, presumably, her love. In Jae-hyun's world, family was the only thing that wasn't for sale. You fought for your blood, you died for your blood. To think that the woman who had been his entire universe was born from a man who spent his nights in a hole like this made a bitter taste rise in the back of his throat. "Wait here," Jae-hyun said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He stepped out of the car, the Parisian drizzle instantly coating his shoulders. He didn't carry an umbrella. He didn't care about the cold. He adjusted his leather gloves, the snap of the button sounding like a gunshot in the quiet street, and crossed the road. He pushed open the door to the basement, and the smell hit him. Stale tobacco, cheap gin, and the unmistakable sour tang of desperation. The bar was a cavern of flickering neon and mismatched furniture. A few shadows slumped over tables, their faces obscured by the gloom. In the far corner, hunched over a green felt table that had seen better decades, was Ezekiel Cole. He looked nothing like the dignified art dealer Naomi had described in her stories. The man Jae-hyun saw was a hollowed-out husk. His hair was a matted gray. His suit was stained and oversized, and his hands shook as he clutched a handful of greasy cards. Jae-hyun walked toward him, his presence clearing the room without a single word. The few patrons who saw him coming didn't look twice. They looked away. There was an aura around Jae-hyun that screamed, predator. A coldness that made the air in the room drop several degrees. He stopped directly behind Ezekiel, his shadow falling over the table like an eclipse. Ezekiel Cole, Jae-hyun said. His voice was low, melodic, and terrifying. The man started, nearly dropping his cards. He turned around, squinting through the dim light, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. I don't have it yet. Give me another hour. The cards are turning. I can feel it. Just one more hour. Jae-hyun didn't wait for him to finish. He reached down, grabbed Ezekiel by the back of his collar, and hauled him upward. The man was light, brittle as a dry twig. Jae-hyun dragged him toward a private booth in the deepest corner of the bar, ignoring the weak protests and the flailing of Ezekiel's thin arms. He threw him onto the cracked leather seat and sat across from him, leaning forward until their faces were inches apart. Look at me, Jae-hyun commanded. Ezekiel looked. He saw the sharp, obsidian eyes of a man who had killed for less than a secret. He saw the impeccable tailoring and the raw power radiating from Jae-hyun. The realization finally hit him. This wasn't a local debt collector. This was something far worse. This was a nightmare from the east. You're the one, Ezekiel whispered, his voice cracking. The one from Seoul. Naomi's friend. Friend. Jae-hyun's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a predatory baring of teeth. 7 months, Ezekiel. 7 months I've been looking for her. 7 months of silence. She was supposed to come back to me. She was supposed to finish her program. Instead, she vanished. And I find you here, in a hole, gambling with ghosts. I had to. Ezekiel suddenly shrieked, a desperate, high-pitched sound. He lunged forward as if to grab Jae-hyun's lapels but stopped when he saw Jae-hyun's hand move toward the table. The gallery, the art market crashed. I owed people, Jae-hyun. Dangerous people. They were going to kill me. They were going to burn everything. Jae-hyun's hand shot out, his fingers locking around Ezekiel's throat. He didn't squeeze hard, not yet. But the threat was absolute. Ezekiel's breath hitched, his eyes bulging. I don't care about your gallery, Jae-hyun hissed. I don't care about your life. Where is Naomi? Why did she stop calling? Why is her phone dead? Ezekiel's hands clawed at Jae-hyun's wrist, but it was like trying to move a bar of solid iron. I made a deal. He wheezed, the words tumbling out in a rush of terror and shame. A merger. That's what I told her. I told her I found a partner who would save us. A man with a legacy. A man who could protect the family name. Jae-hyun's grip tightened slightly. A partner? Or a buyer? The silence that followed was louder than the drone of the city outside. Ezekiel's head slumped, his gaze falling to the floor. He couldn't look at the dragon anymore. The shame was too heavy, a physical weight that finally broke the last of his pride.
Malik Laurent, Ezekiel whispered.
He's the son of a shipping magnate. Old money. He had the power to wipe my slate clean. Every debt, every lien, gone. He wanted a wife, a trophy, someone elegant, someone who would look good at his side during the galas. He saw a photo of Naomi. He wouldn't settle for anyone else. Jae-hyun felt a cold, sharp blade of ice pierce his heart. He let go of Ezekiel's throat, not because he was merciful, but because the revulsion he felt was so strong he couldn't stand to touch the man anymore. He pulled back, his face a mask of frozen fury. You sold her, Jae-hyun said. The words were quiet, but they echoed with the finality of a tombstone. You sold your daughter to pay for your cards, to save your own pathetic skin. It wasn't like that, Ezekiel pleaded, tears finally leaking from his red-rimmed eyes. I thought he would take care of her. He's rich. He has everything. She was supposed to be a queen. How was I to know? How was I to know he was like that? Jae-hyun leaned back into the shadows of the booth, his mind racing. Like what, Ezekiel? Speak. Every word you withhold is another minute of pain I will visit upon you later. He's a monster, Ezekiel sobbed, burying his face in his hands. Once the papers were signed, once she was legally his, he changed. He moved her to an apartment in the 7th. He cut her off from everyone. He took her papers, her phone. He told me if I ever tried to see her, he'd put me in the Seine with a concrete suit. And then she got pregnant. Jae-hyun's entire world stopped. The air in his lungs felt like liquid lead. Pregnant. Yes, Ezekiel whimpered. 7 months along. Or maybe 8. I don't know. I saw her once 3 weeks ago through a window. She was unrecognizable, Jae-hyun. She was thin, tattered. She looked like she hadn't slept in years. Malik was with her. He was screaming. He hit her. Right there in the street. And she just took it. She didn't even fight back. She just covered her stomach and walked into the house like a dog. Jae-hyun closed his eyes. The image Ezekiel described burned into his retinas. A visceral, agonizing picture of the woman he loved. The woman who had been so vibrant and full of life and soul, being broken by a man who treated her like property. And the child she was protecting. 7 months. The timeline was a jagged glass edge. She was in Korea 7 months ago, Jae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more dangerous than a roar. She left my bed to come to Paris. Ezekiel looked up, a flickering light of realization in his eyes. Then the baby, Malik knows. He knows it's not his. That's why he does it. That's why he hates her. He calls her a whore of the East. He treats that child like a disease he's waiting to excise. The table between them suddenly splintered as Jae-hyun's fist slammed down onto the wood. The sound was deafening. A crack of thunder that caused the entire bar to go silent. Jae-hyun stood up, the movement so sudden and violent that Ezekiel fell backward off his seat, scrambling on the floor like the rat he was. Jae-hyun didn't look down at him. He looked straight ahead, his eyes glowing with a dark, terrifying clarity. The grief that had been his constant companion for 7 months was gone, replaced by a singular, crystalline purpose. He didn't just have a location now. He had a reason. He had a war. Where is the apartment? Jae-hyun asked. Ezekiel rattled off an address in the 7th arrondissement, his voice trembling so much it was barely intelligible. He stayed on the floor, weeping, a broken man who had realized too late that he had traded his soul for a few more hours at a gambling table. Jae-hyun turned and walked away. He didn't look back at the rat in the hole. He didn't care if Ezekiel lived or died. The man was already a ghost. As Jae-hyun stepped back out into the Parisian rain, Secretary Choi was already holding the car door open. He saw the expression on Jae-hyun's face, the cold, absolute stillness of the dragon before the strike, and he knew that the time for talking was over. We have the address, Jae-hyun said as he slid into the back seat. The 7th arrondissement.
Rue de Grenelle.
Sir Choi asked, sensing the shift in his boss's energy. She's there, Jae-hyun said, his voice devoid of emotion. And she's not alone. She's carrying my child. And a man named Malik Laurent thinks he can own them both. Jae-hyun pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a series of commands. Within seconds, his global network began to hum. Bank accounts in Paris were flagged. Shipping manifests in the Mediterranean were intercepted. Security dossiers on the Laurent family were downloaded to his device. He was no longer just a man looking for a woman. He was a general mobilizing for a siege. What are your orders, boss? Choi asked, his voice steady. Jae-hyun looked out the window as the car accelerated, the lights of Paris blurring into long streaks of gold and red. He thought about Naomi, not the woman in the lecture hall, but the woman Ezekiel had described. Tattered, bruised, shaking. He thought about the child, his blood, growing in a house of fear. I want the Laurent family dismantled, Jae-hyun said. I want their wealth evaporated by morning. I want their name turned into a curse. But Malik belongs to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. He opened it, the 5-carat blue diamond catching the stray light from the street lamps. It was beautiful. It was a promise. And as he looked at it, the rage in his heart didn't diminish. It sharpened. Malik Laurent is going to learn a very important lesson tonight, Jae-hyun whispered, snapping the box shut. He's going to learn that you can buy a debt. You can buy a gallery. You can even buy a father's loyalty. He leaned his head back, his eyes narrowing as the car turned toward the 7th arrondissement. But you can never, ever buy the dragon's heart. And you certainly can't survive the fire when he comes to take it back. The car moved silently through the streets of Paris, a black predator in a city that had no idea what was about to hit it. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime of the 19th arrondissement, but it couldn't wash away the blood that Jae-hyun knew would be spilled before the sun rose. Naomi was waiting, his child was waiting, and the dragon was finally here to pay the bill. The silence in the car was absolute, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Jae-hyun stared at the back of the driver's head, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He wasn't thinking about the how anymore. He was thinking about the when. He was thinking about the moment he would finally see her. He wondered if she would recognize him through the trauma. He wondered if the child would feel his presence through the walls of her skin. 20 minutes to the address, sir, Choi reported. Jae-hyun nodded. He felt a strange, cold calm settling over him. It was the calm of a man who knew exactly what he had to do. He had spent 7 months in a fog of grief and confusion. Now the fog had cleared. The enemy had a name. The mission had a location. He touched the ring box one last time, a silent vow in the dark. I'm coming, Naomi, he thought, and God help anyone standing in my way. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of Paris like a ghost made of shadow and steel. Jae-hyun watched the city change through the tinted glass. The grime of the 19th arrondissement, where he had left Ezekiel Cole trembling on a basement floor, gave way to the intimidating elegance of the 7th. Here, the architecture was a testament to old power. Tall, pale limestone facades with ornate wrought iron balconies and massive wooden doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in a century. This was the territory of the Laurents, a family that hid its rot behind classical symmetry and gold leaf. Secretary Choi sat in the front seat, his eyes glued to a tablet that displayed the building's layout. Rue de Grenelle, he whispered, as if the name itself were a secret. 3rd floor. The windows overlook a narrow inner courtyard as well as the street. Malik Laurent has 3 security personnel on rotation, but they aren't professionals. They're local muscle, hired more for intimidation than protection. Jae-hyun didn't respond. He didn't need to hear about the muscle. He was looking at his own reflection in the window, seeing the hard, unyielding lines of a man who had forgotten how to breathe without the weight of vengeance in his lungs. He was dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat, his hands gloved, his expression as frozen as the winter he had carried from Seoul. The car slowed to a crawl as they entered the Rue de Grenelle. It was a street that smelled of damp stone and expensive perfume, quiet and suffocatingly private. Jae-hyun signaled for the driver to stop a few buildings away. He didn't want the sound of the engine to announce his arrival. He wanted to move like the dark water of the Seine, silent, deep, and lethal. Wait for my signal, Jae-hyun said. He stepped out of the car, the Parisian rain immediately greeting him like an old enemy. He walked with a measured, predatory grace. He didn't look at the luxury boutiques or the flickering lanterns of the high-end bistros. His eyes were fixed on a specific set of windows on the 3rd floor. They were dark, save for a faint, flickering amber glow that suggested a single lamp or perhaps a television left on to drown out the silence. Jae-hyun didn't go to the front door. He circled the building, finding a narrow service alleyway that led to the inner courtyard. His movements were instinctive, honed by a decade of urban warfare in the backstreets of Incheon. He scaled a low stone wall and found himself in the courtyard. It was a cold, hollow space, the rain echoing against the cobblestones. Above him, the balconies of the elite rose up like the bars of a gilded cage. He looked up. The 3rd floor balcony was directly above a decorative stone ledge. Jae-hyun didn't hesitate. He reached for the ironwork, his muscles coiling and releasing with the efficiency of a panther. Within seconds, he was perched on the ledge, his body pressed against the cold limestone. He was close now, so close he could hear the muffled sound of a car passing on the street outside. He shifted his weight, moving toward the tall, wooden-framed window. The shutters were partially closed, but there was a gap, a sliver of light that allowed him to see into the belly of the beast. Jae-hyun held his breath. His heart, which had been a steady, icy drumbeat, suddenly faltered. There, in the center of a room that was filled with priceless antiques and heavy velvet drapes, was Naomi. But it wasn't the Naomi of his memories. The woman he had spent 7 months dreaming of was a creature of light, vibrant, laughing. Her skin glowing under the neon of Seoul, her eyes bright with the promise of a future she had seen in him. The woman he saw through the glass was a shadow of that person. She was sitting on the edge of a high-backed chair, her body slumped as if the very air in the room was too heavy to bear. She was wearing a beige cardigan that looked several sizes too large, draped over a simple black dress. Her skin, once so radiant, was sallow, almost translucent under the dim light. There were dark, violet hollows beneath her eyes, and her hair, which she used to wear in a proud, messy crown, was thin and lank, clinging to her neck. She looked tattered. She looked like a piece of silk that had been caught in a storm and left to fray on the rocks. Jae-hyun's grip on the stone ledge tightened until the rough limestone bit into his palms. His gaze dropped to her midsection, and his breath hitched. She was heavily pregnant. Her stomach was a prominent, rounded mound beneath the black fabric, a stark contrast to her otherwise fragile frame. She looked 8 months along, perhaps more. She was protecting it. Even in her stillness, her hands were folded over her belly, her fingers interlaced in a protective weave. It was his child. Jae-hyun knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. He could feel the tether between them, a golden cord of blood and destiny that pulled at his very soul. That was his heir, his legacy, growing inside a woman who looked like she was being slowly extinguished. As he watched, Naomi shifted. She reached out with a trembling hand toward a glass of water on the side table. Her sleeve slid back, revealing a thin, bony wrist, and a jagged, yellowing bruise that disappeared into the crook of her elbow. A roar of white-hot rage erupted in Jae-hyun's chest, so violent he feared he might shatter the glass with his mind. Malik Laurent hadn't just bought her. He was breaking her. He was treating the woman who held the dragon's heart like a piece of livestock to be beaten into submission. Naomi didn't drink the water. She just held the glass, her eyes fixed on the door to the room. It was a look of pure, unadulterated terror, the look of a prisoner waiting for the sound of the executioner's footsteps. She flinched at a sudden noise from somewhere else in the apartment, her entire body jerking as she pulled her legs up onto the chair, curling into herself as much as her pregnancy would allow. Jae-hyun's vision went red at the edges. He wanted to kick the window in. He wanted to tear the throat out of anyone who had ever raised a hand to her. He wanted to burn this beautiful, soulless building to the ground and carry her through the ashes. But he forced himself to stay still. He was a professional. A strike made in blind rage was a strike that could miss. He needed to see more. He needed to know where the threats were. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. A man walked in. He was tall, dressed in an expensive silk robe, his hair perfectly coiffed.
Malik Laurent.
He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, and his gait was loose, the walk of a man who was comfortably, dangerously drunk. He didn't look at Naomi with love or even lust. He looked at her with a cold, simmering resentment. He said something, the words were muffled by the glass, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a snarl. Naomi shrank back, her eyes wide, her hands clenching over her stomach. She shook her head, a silent plea. Malik stepped closer, his free hand reaching out to grip her chin, forcing her to look up at him. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his mouth moving in a rapid-fire assault of insults. Jae-hyun saw Naomi's eyes fill with tears, saw a single drop slide down her gaunt cheek. Malik laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that Jae-hyun felt in his marrow, and shoved her chin away. He took a long pull from his drink and stood over her, his shadow looming large against the far wall. He raised his hand, not to strike, but in a mocking gesture of power, watching her flinch as if he had already landed the blow. Jae-hyun realized then that Malik Laurent wasn't just a husband. He was a jailer, And the child Naomi was carrying was the only reason she was still breathing, and the very reason Malik hated her. Naomi looked toward the window then. For a brief, heart-stopping second, her eyes seemed to lock onto the gap in the shutters where Jae-hyun stood. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He wanted to project every ounce of his soul through the glass, to tell her that the dragon was here, that the 7 months of silence were over, and that the world was about to pay its debt. She didn't see him. She couldn't. To her, the window was just a reflection of her own misery. She turned away, her head bowing, her shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. Jae-hyun lowered himself from the ledge, his movements fluid and silent. He landed back in the courtyard, the rain soaking through his coat, but he felt like he was walking through a furnace. The cold didn't reach him anymore. Nothing could. He walked back to the sedan, his face a mask of such absolute, terrifying stillness that even Secretary Choi took a step back as he opened the door. "Sir?" Choi asked, his voice a whisper. Jae-hyun sat in the back seat. He didn't look at the tablet. He didn't look at the street. He looked at his hands, encased in black leather. "She's there," Jae-hyun said. His voice was a low vibration, like the growl of an engine before it roars. "She is thin. She is broken. She is terrified of the sound of a door opening." He looked up at Choi, and for the first time in 10 years, Choi saw a flicker of something in Jae-hyun's eyes that made him want to pray for the souls of his enemies. "She is 8 months pregnant, Choi," Jae-hyun continued. "And that man, that dog, he touched her. He has been touching her for months while I sat in Seoul like a fool." "What are your orders, sir?" Jae-hyun leaned back into the darkness of the car. The Rue de Grenelle was quiet, but the air was thick with the scent of an impending storm. "I don't want an extraction yet," Jae-hyun said. "If we take her now, he will use his lawyers, his police, his name to chase her. He thinks he owns her because of a contract. He thinks he's safe because he's a Laurent in Paris." Jae-hyun pulled the velvet box from his pocket and looked at it one last time. He didn't open it. He just gripped it until the corners dug into his palm. "I want him to watch his world disappear first," Jae-hyun said. "I want him to lose his money. I want him to lose his reputation. I want him to lose every single thing that makes him feel like a man. And when he is standing in the ruins of his life, with nothing left but his own skin, that is when I will walk through his front door." "And the woman, sir? Naomi?" Jae-hyun looked back up at the third-floor window. The amber light was still there, a tiny, flickering flame in the dark heart of the 7th arrondissement. "Tell the men to surround the building," Jae-hyun ordered. "Nobody enters. Nobody leaves. If Malik Laurent so much as raises his voice to her again, I want his tongue. But for now, we wait. We wait for the sun to go down on the Laurent legacy." The sedan pulled away, leaving the Rue de Grenelle behind. But the dragon remained. He was in the shadows of the alleyways. He was in the rain on the rooftops. He was the silent, invisible pressure beginning to close in on the house of Laurent. 7 months of silence were over. The dragon had seen his queen in chains, and he had seen his heir in the womb of a prisoner. Paris was about to learn that some debts can't be settled with gold. Some debts can only be settled with the kind of fire that leaves nothing but bone and ash. As the car turned onto the main boulevard, Jae-hyun closed his eyes. He could still see her, the bruise on her wrist, the fear in her eyes, the way she held her stomach. "Hold on, Naomi," he whispered into the dark. "Just a little longer. The dragon is here, and I'm going to burn this city down until you're warm again." The following 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled, agonizing observation. Kang Jae-hyun did not retreat to a luxury hotel or seek the comfort of a warm bed. Instead, he occupied a cold, high-ceilinged flat directly across from the Rue de Grenelle, a space secured by Secretary Choi within 3 hours of their arrival. It was a sterile, unfurnished room that smelled of dust and old wax, but it offered what Jae-hyun needed: a direct, unobstructed line of sight into the gilded cage where Naomi Cole was being unmade. Jae-hyun stood by the window, a silhouette carved from the darkness, his eyes never leaving the third-floor balcony across the street. He watched the routine of the Laurent household, a cycle of domestic horror that moved with the sickening precision of a clock. Through the lens of high-powered binoculars, the distance between his rage and her reality vanished. He wasn't just watching a woman. He was witnessing the systematic crushing of a soul. The routine always began at 10 in the morning. That was when the heavy velvet drapes in the master suite would be pulled back, not by a maid, but by Naomi herself. Jae-hyun watched her struggle with the weight of the fabric, her thin arms shaking, her movements slow and deliberate to accommodate the heavy burden of her 8-month pregnancy. She moved like someone walking through deep water, every step a calculated effort to avoid a misstep that might draw attention. Then came Malik Laurent. The man was a shadow that loomed over every corner of that apartment. He didn't just walk into a room, he occupied it like a suffocating gas. Malik was the image of Parisian high society. Lean, dressed in tailored silk shirts and cashmere sweaters. His face handsome in a way that felt sharp and predatory. Jae-hyun watched him at the breakfast table, hidden behind a newspaper while Naomi sat across from him, her eyes fixed on her plate. She didn't eat. She picked at her food, her shoulders hunched, waiting for the first verbal strike of the day. It usually started with a gesture. Malik would lower his paper, his eyes raking over her with a look of profound disgust. Jae-hyun couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way Naomi's head would bow lower, the way her hand would instinctively move to cover her stomach. Malik would point at her, his mouth moving in a rapid, serrated rhythm, his face contorting with a sneer. He treated her presence like a stain on his immaculate life, a debt he was forced to carry. The most agonizing part for Jae-hyun was the child. Whenever Malik's rage intensified, Naomi's protective instincts took over. She would curl her body around her womb, a silent, maternal shield. Malik seemed to hate the child even more than he hated the mother. He would gesture at her stomach with a flick of his wrist, a dismissive, loathing motion that suggested he saw the life inside her not as a human being, but as a piece of foreign evidence, a reminder of the man she had loved in Seoul. In the afternoons, Malik would leave for his business, which, according to Choi's reports, mostly consisted of losing the remnants of the Laurent fortune in private clubs, and the apartment would fall into a different kind of silence. This was when the tattered Naomi surfaced. Jae-hyun watched her pace the living room, her hand pressed into the small of her back, her face a mask of exhaustion and pain. She would stop at the window sometimes, looking out at the Rue de Grenelle with a hollow, yearning expression that broke Jae-hyun's heart. She wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a memory of a time when she was safe. Once, she approached a bookshelf and pulled out a small, worn volume. As she opened it, a slip of paper fell out. A photo. Jae-hyun adjusted the focus of his lens. It was a grainy, candid shot of the two of them in Seoul, taken during a sunset at the Han River. He saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips, a flicker of the woman who had once carved his name into a desk. But the moment was fleeting. She heard a noise, perhaps a door closing in the hallway or a car backfiring on the street, and she scrambled to hide the photo, her movements frantic and panicked. The fear was so deeply ingrained in her nervous system that even the wind was an enemy. The evening was the worst. Malik would return, often smelling of gin and failure, and the atmosphere in the apartment would turn electric with malice. Jae-hyun watched through the glass as Malik cornered her in the library. He didn't always use his fists. His favorite weapon seemed to be psychological. He would stand over her while she sat on the floor, his height a weapon of intimidation, talking down to her for hours. He would take her chin in his hand, not with affection, but with a grip that made her flinch, forcing her to look at him while he dismantled her dignity piece by piece. Jae-hyun's knuckles turned white against the window frame. He felt like he was watching a slow-motion execution. Every time Malik raised his voice, every time he made Naomi tremble, a new layer of ice formed over Jae-hyun's heart. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity, a man who had dealt in death and betrayal for a decade, but this, the calculated, intimate cruelty of a husband toward a pregnant woman, was a level of depravity he hadn't fully understood until now. "He's not just a bully, sir," Choi whispered from the shadows of the room. "He's a sadist. He knows she has nowhere to go. He knows her father sold her. He knows she is carrying a child that he believes is a stain on his lineage. He is keeping her alive only to punish her. Jae-hyun didn't turn around. He thinks he is the master of this house, Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure lethality. He thinks his name protects him. He thinks the walls of that apartment are thick enough to hide his crimes. Jae-hyun looked at his phone. The data was pouring in. The Laurent shipping interests were already seeing their contracts cancelled. 2 of Malik's primary creditors had been bought out by Kang-affiliated shells and were preparing to call in their loans by morning. The social circles of Paris were beginning to whisper about a financial contagion following the Laurent name. Is the security detail in place? Jae-hyun asked. Yes, boss. We have 4 men in the apartment below and 2 on the roof. They are waiting for your word. If Malik raises a hand to strike her with intent to cause harm, they will breach. No, Jae-hyun said, his eyes narrowing as Malik grabbed Naomi's arm across the street, dragging her toward the bedroom. I don't want to breach yet. I want him to feel the walls closing in. I want him to wake up tomorrow and realize he is a pauper. I want him to feel the fear she feels, the fear of a door opening and a monster walking in. Jae-hyun watched as the lights in the bedroom across the street flickered out. He stood there in the dark for hours, his gaze never wavering. He imagined the layout of the apartment, the distance between the door and the bed, the weight of the air in that room. He thought about the ring in his pocket, the blue diamond that was meant for a woman who could still laugh. He realized that he couldn't just take her back to Seoul. He couldn't just rescue her. He had to purge the memory of Malik Laurent from her skin. He had to ensure that when she looked at her child, she didn't see the shadow of the 7th arrondissement. The rain began to fall again, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the lights of Paris. Jae-hyun leaned his forehead against the cold glass. 7 months, he whispered. You survived 7 months of this, Naomi. He thought of her at the airport waving goodbye. He thought of her in the lecture hall. And then he thought of her now, tattered, thin, protecting his blood with the last of her strength. The dragon was no longer just seeking a lover. He was seeking a reckoning. Tomorrow, Jae-hyun said to the empty room. Tomorrow, the sun rises on a different world for Malik Laurent, and it sets on his life. He turned away from the window, but the image of Naomi flinching stayed burned into his mind. The routine was over. The cycle was about to be shattered. And as Kang Jae-hyun sat in the dark, waiting for the dawn, he wasn't a businessman, a boss, or a CEO. He was the nightmare that Malik Laurent hadn't seen coming. The next morning, the sun struggled to break through the Paris fog. Jae-hyun was already at the window watching. The routine started again. The curtains pulled back. The breakfast table. The silent, terrified woman. But today the phone rang. Jae-hyun saw Malik answer it. He saw the man's face drain of color. He saw the way Malik's hand began to shake as he listened to his lawyers tell him that his world was vanishing. Malik looked at Naomi, his eyes wild and accusing, as if this were somehow her fault. He stepped toward her, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Jae-hyun gripped the hilt of the knife tucked into his waistband. Go ahead, Malik, Jae-hyun whispered, his eyes glowing with a dark, predatory light. Give me a reason to end this early. The husband hesitated. The phone rang again, and then again. The siege had begun. And across the street, in the cold shadows of a sterile flat, the dragon smiled for the first time in 7 months. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of harvest. The debt was coming due, and Kang Jae-hyun was here to collect it in person. The third day in Paris brought a biting wind that rattled the window panes of Jae-hyun's observation post, but for the first time in 7 months, the atmospheric pressure in the 7th arrondissement had shifted. The financial assault was working. Malik Laurent had left the apartment 3 hours earlier than usual, his face a frantic mask of sweat and desperation as he shouted into 2 different phones. His silk tie loosened like a noose. He had forgotten to lock the double bolt on the outer door, a mistake born of the panic Jae-hyun had carefully cultivated from across the street. Jae-hyun stood by the window, watching the tail lights of Malik's car disappear around the corner of Rue de Grenelle. He didn't move for several minutes, his eyes tracking the shadows in Naomi's apartment. He saw her move toward the kitchen, her silhouette heavy and weary against the morning light. She was alone. The security muscle Malik had hired were currently occupied with a building maintenance inspection, orchestrated by Choi, a distraction that left the back service entrance vulnerable for exactly 12 minutes. "It is time," Jae-hyun said. He didn't send a subordinate. He didn't trust the weight of this moment to anyone else's hands. Jae-hyun slipped into a simple black windbreaker over his suit, pulling the hood low. He looked like any other Parisian local avoiding the rain as he crossed the street. He moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, slipping through the service gate and up the narrow, back stairwell used by the help. His heart was no longer a drum. It was a cold, precision instrument. He reached the third-floor landing. The service door to the Laurent kitchen was heavy oak, but the lock was a standard tumbler. Jae-hyun pulled a slim silver tool from his pocket, and with 2 practiced clicks, the door gave way. He stepped inside, the air of the apartment immediately wrapping around him. It smelled of expensive lilies, floor wax, and the sterile, metallic scent of a hospital. It was a beautiful tomb. He heard the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic. He followed the sound, moving through the shadows of the dining room until he reached the archway of the kitchen. Naomi was standing at the counter, her back to him. She was trying to pour a glass of milk, but her hand was shaking so violently that the carton rattled against the rim of the glass. She looked even more fragile up close. The beige cardigan was pilled at the elbows, and the skin of her neck was so pale it looked like parchment. Jae-hyun felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to break his professional composure. He wanted to call her name. He wanted to rush forward and pull her into his arms, to tell her that the nightmare was over. But he knew the state of her nerves. A sudden voice, a sudden touch, could send her into a shock that might harm the baby. He had to be the ghost she needed before he could be the man she loved. He stepped back into the shadows and placed a small object on the edge of the mahogany dining table, directly in her line of sight for when she would inevitably walk back toward the living room. It was a single, dried blue hydrangea blossom, encased in a small glass locket. It was a relic from their first spring in Seoul. They had walked through the gardens of the Blue House, and he had tucked a similar blossom behind her ear, promising her that as long as the flowers bloomed, he would be by her side. It was a signal that only she would understand. It was the mark of the dragon. Jae-hyun retreated into the pantry, pulling the door until only a sliver of light remained. He waited. Moments later, he heard the slow, dragging footsteps of her slippers against the hardwood. Naomi walked into the dining room, her head down, her eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for a reason to keep moving. She reached the table and stopped. For a long heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Jae-hyun watched through the crack in the door. Naomi's hand, still clutching the glass of milk, froze in midair. Her gaze had fallen on the locket. Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the quiet of the apartment. She set the glass down with a trembling hand, her eyes wide, her pupils dilating until they were pools of obsidian. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the glass locket as if she expected it to vanish or burn her. When her skin finally touched it, she let out a broken, high-pitched whimper. She pulled the locket to her chest, clutching it with both hands, her head bowing as a violent tremor shook her entire frame. "Jay!" she whispered. The name was barely a breath, a ghost of a sound she hadn't dared to utter in 7 months. She looked around the room, her eyes frantic, searching the shadows. She wasn't afraid. For the first time, the terror that had defined her existence was replaced by a desperate, wild hope. She knew the only man in the world who could find a blue hydrangea in the middle of a Parisian winter had finally arrived. Jae-hyun stayed in the darkness. He saw her lips move as she began to sob, not the silent, exhausted tears he had seen through the window, but deep, racking gasps of air. She sank into one of the velvet chairs, her hand pressing the locket against her heart, her other hand shielding her stomach. "You found me," she sobbed into the empty room. "You actually found me." Jae-hyun knew he had to leave. Malik's security would be returning from their inspection soon, and the window of opportunity was closing. But he couldn't leave her without one more sign. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. On it, he had written 3 words in the bold, sharp calligraphy she used to tease him about. Wait for me. As Naomi stood up, trying to regain her balance, Jae-hyun made a deliberate sound. The soft click of the service door latch. Naomi whirled around, her eyes fixed on the kitchen. She hurried toward the service entrance, her gait awkward but fast. By the time she reached the kitchen, the door was closed, but the note was pinned to the frame at eye level. She grabbed the paper, her eyes devouring the 3 words. She pressed the note to her lips, her knees finally giving out. She sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the cold marble and the expensive appliances of her prison. And for the first time in 210 days, she felt the warmth of the sun. I'll wait, she whispered, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't possessed since she left Incheon. I'll wait forever. Jae-hyun was already halfway down the back stairs, his pulse racing, his mind on fire. He had seen the transformation. He had seen the light return to her eyes. The tattered woman was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the dragon was at the gate. He stepped out into the alleyway and signaled to Choi, who was waiting in the sedan. Jae-hyun climbed into the back seat, his face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. She knows, Jae-hyun said. And the husband, sir? Choi asked. Jae-hyun looked at the 3rd-floor window one last time. He saw the curtain flutter, Naomi, looking out, clutching the locket to the glass. Malik Laurent is a dead man walking, Jae-hyun said. He just doesn't know it yet. Start the final phase. I want his banks to freeze by noon. I want the police at his gallery by 2. And I want the front door of that apartment unlocked by 6. Jae-hyun leaned back, his eyes closing. He could still feel the phantom sensation of being in the same room as her. The scent of her, faint, like vanilla and fear, was still in his lungs. The silent contact was over. The war of shadows was finishing. Tonight, the dragon would step out of the darkness and into the light of the Rue de Grenelle. And the world would finally see what happens when you try to cage something that was born to fly. As the car pulled away, Naomi stood at the window, her hand resting on the glass. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't shrinking. She looked out at the city of Paris, and for the first time she didn't see a prison. She saw a battlefield, and she knew her champion was already winning. The glass locket felt warm against her skin, a physical anchor to a life she thought she had lost. She looked down at her stomach, at the child who had survived the winter of the 7th arrondissement. He's here, she whispered to the life inside her. Your father is here. Across the street, in the high-ceilinged flat, Jae-hyun opened the velvet box. The blue diamond sparkled in the gray light of the afternoon. It wasn't just a ring anymore. It was a crown. The 7 months of silence were officially broken. The dragon had spoken, and the echo of his voice was about to bring the house of Laurent down in a rain of fire and gold. The wait was almost over. The return was beginning. And as the clock on the mantelpiece in the Laurent apartment ticked toward 6, the very air seemed to hold its breath. The dragon was coming home, and he wasn't coming alone. He was bringing the weight of an empire and the fury of a father. Malik Laurent had no idea that the man he had called a ghost of the East was currently deciding which part of his life to destroy first. Jae-hyun watched the second hand of his watch. Wait for me, he had promised. And Kang Jae-hyun never broke a promise to the woman who held his heart. The transition from the clinical, suffocating silence of the 7th arrondissement back to the jagged, neon-lit grime of the 19th felt like descending from a sterile mountain into an open grave. Kang Jae-hyun sat in the rear of the black sedan, his silhouette a motionless blade of shadow. Naomi was safe. She was currently under the watch of his personal medical team in a secured villa on the outskirts of the city, sedated and dreaming of a world that didn't smell of limestone and fear. But for Jae-hyun, the cycle was incomplete. The extraction was a tactical victory, but the spiritual rot remained. To heal the wound, he had to cut out the infection at its source. He didn't think of Ezekiel Cole as a father. To Jae-hyun, the word father carried the weight of a mountain. It was a title of protection, of lineage, of unyielding sacrifice. Ezekiel was something else entirely. He was a broker of flesh, a man who had appraised his own blood and found it less valuable than a stack of chips on a green felt table. "He's back at the cellar," Secretary Choi said, his voice as dry as the dust in the abandoned flat they had just vacated. The house credit he thought he secured from Malik was revoked the moment the Laurent accounts were frozen. "He's been trying to talk his way back into the game for 2 hours. The management is impatient." Jae-hyun looked at his hands. They were clean, the knuckles no longer white, but his heart was a furnace. Good. Let him be desperate. A man in despair is the only version of Ezekiel Cole that is honest. The car came to a halt at the edge of the alley. The rain had turned into a thick, clinging mist that blurred the yellow glow of the street lamps. Jae-hyun stepped out, his long overcoat billowing like a shroud. He didn't wait for his men to flank him. This was a private reckoning. He walked down the concrete stairs, the heavy metal door of the basement bar groaning as he pushed it open. The air inside was thicker than before, sour with the smell of spilled beer and the desperate sweat of men who had traded their futures for a chance at a miracle. Ezekiel was cornered near the back of the room, held against the wall by a burly man with scarred knuckles. The gambler was pleading, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that set Jae-hyun's teeth on edge. "I have the money. My son-in-law is a Laurent. Do you know what that name means in this city?" Ezekiel shrieked. "It means a vacuum." Jae-hyun's voice cut through the room, low and resonant, like a tolling bell. The burly man froze. Ezekiel's head snapped toward the sound. When he saw Jae-hyun standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness of the alley, his eyes two pits of cold, dark fire, the gambler's knees finally gave out. The man with the scarred knuckles stepped back, sensing the arrival of a predator that occupied a much higher place on the food chain. "Jae-hyun," Ezekiel gasped, sliding down the wall. You saved her? Is she safe? Tell me she's safe." Jae-hyun didn't answer. He walked toward Ezekiel, the crowd of gamblers parting like the Red Sea. He didn't stop until he was standing over the man, his shadow swallowing Ezekiel whole. He reached down and gripped Ezekiel's collar, hoisting him up with a terrifying, effortless strength. He didn't drag him to a booth this time. He dragged him toward the back of the bar, through a door that led to a cold storage room filled with crates of empty bottles and the hum of a failing compressor. He threw Ezekiel against a stack of wooden crates. The man tumbled, his thin limbs flailing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You told me you made a deal for a merger," Jae-hyun said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "You told me you thought he would take care of her." "I did. I swear on my life," Ezekiel cried, clutching his chest. "Your life has no value, Ezekiel. Do not swear on something so worthless." Jae-hyun stepped into the pale light of a single hanging bulb. "I saw her. I saw the apartment. I saw the bruises on her wrists and the terror in her eyes when a door opened. I saw the child, my son, who has spent 8 months in a cage because you couldn't stop chasing a winning hand." Ezekiel's face contorted. He began to sob, but there was no dignity in it. It was the weeping of a man who was sorry he was caught, not sorry for what he had done. "I was in debt, Jay. They were going to break my legs. They were going to burn the gallery. Then you should have let them break your legs," Jae-hyun hissed, leaning down until his face was inches from Ezekiel's. "You should have let them burn the gallery. You should have stood in the fire yourself. That is what a father does. Instead, you pushed your daughter into the flames so you could keep walking." Jae-hyun reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto Ezekiel's lap. The man's eyes widened as he saw the corners of high-denomination euro notes peeking out. "There it is," Jae-hyun said. "The price of your daughter. The sale you wanted to finalize." Ezekiel reached for the money, his fingers twitching with an addiction so deep it bypassed his fear. What is this for?" "It's for your exit," Jae-hyun said. "Joy?" Secretary Choi stepped out of the shadows, holding a one-way ticket and a passport. "A flight to Macau," Choi said. "It leaves in 4 hours. There is a permanent residence waiting for you there. A small apartment above a casino. The money in that envelope is all you will ever receive. It is enough to gamble for a month or to live for a year. The choice is yours." Ezekiel looked at the money, then at the ticket. A flicker of his old greed returned. Macau? The East? But I don't know anyone there. Exactly, Jae-hyun said. You are leaving Paris tonight. You are leaving Europe. You are leaving any world where Naomi Cole exists. If you ever attempt to contact her, if you ever so much as speak her name to a stranger, I will not send a check. I will send a man who will ensure you never speak again. Jae-hyun leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a freezing wind. You told me once that you wanted her to be a queen. Tonight she is exactly that. She is the mother of the Kang heir. And a queen does not have a father who trades her for a seat at a table. From this moment on, you are dead to her. You are a ghost. You are a bad dream she had 7 months ago. Ezekiel looked at the money, his soul finally laid bare. He didn't ask how Naomi was. He didn't ask if the baby was healthy. He simply clutched the envelope to his chest and nodded, his eyes already drifting toward the promise of the bright lights in Macau. I'll go, Ezekiel whispered. I'll never come back. I know you won't, Jae-hyun said, standing up, because you love the game more than you love your blood. And that is why you are the smallest man I have ever met. Jae-hyun turned his back on him. He didn't need to see the departure. He didn't need the satisfaction of watching Ezekiel scramble toward the airport. The man was already erased. He was a debt that had been settled, a line item in a ledger that was now closed. As Jae-hyun walked out of the cold storage room and back through the bar, the silence followed him. He stepped out into the Parisian night, the rain washing the scent of the basement from his clothes. Secretary Choi followed him to the car. The transport is waiting at the airport, sir, Choi said. He will be watched until the plane is in the air. Make sure of it, Jae-hyun said. He sat in the back of the car, looking out at the city. The lights of the 19th arrondissement were fading as they drove back toward the medical villa. He thought about Naomi. He thought about the way she had looked in the apartment, tattered and broken. He thought about the child, the innocent life that had been used as a pawn by two men, one who wanted to own it and one who had sold it. Jae-hyun felt the weight of the ring in his pocket. The father's debt was paid, but his own debt, the debt of protection he owed to Naomi, was just beginning. He had removed the monsters from her life, but now he had to help her rebuild the woman who had been lost in the dark. Is the medical jet ready for tomorrow? Jae-hyun asked. Yes, boss. We have cleared the flight path. We will be back in Seoul by morning. Jae-hyun nodded. He looked at his reflection in the window. The dragon was no longer hunting. He was returning. He was bringing his family back to the neon, back to the light, back to a world where they would never be for sale again. The car moved through the streets of Paris, a silent protector in a city of shadows. The Rue de Grenelle was a memory. Ezekiel Cole was a ghost. And ahead of them lay the only thing that mattered, the survival of the bloodline. As the car reached the gates of the villa, Jae-hyun saw the light in the upstairs window. Naomi was awake. He didn't wait for the door to be opened. He stepped out of the car and hurried toward the house, his heart beating with a rhythm that wasn't dictated by rage or power, but by the simple, profound need to be home. The father's debt was paid in full. Now it was time for the dragon to become a father himself. He entered the villa, the air warm and smelling of lavender. He walked up the stairs, his footsteps soft. He pushed open the door to her room. Naomi was sitting up in bed, the blue hydrangea locket clutched in her hand. When she saw him, she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She reached out her hand, and for the first time in 7 months, Jae-hyun saw a spark of the woman who had once carved his name into a desk. He's gone, Jae-hyun whispered, taking her hand. Both of them? She asked, her voice small but steady. Both of them. They can never touch you again. Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she finally let out a breath she had been holding for 210 days. The winter of Paris was over. The debt was settled. And as the sun began to rise over the French countryside, the dragon and his queen prepared to fly home. The atmosphere inside the observation flat had reached a boiling point. The air felt heavy, saturated with the smell of ozone and the cold, metallic tang of a weapon being readied. Kang Jae-hyun stood by the window, his eyes narrowed into slits as he watched the Rue de Grenelle. Something was wrong. Malik Laurent's silver coupe had screeched into the courtyard 3 hours ahead of schedule. The financial siege had hit harder and faster than anticipated, and the cornered rat was returning to the only place where he still felt like a king. Jae-hyun didn't wait for a report. He didn't check the monitors. He saw Malik stumble out of the car, his movements frantic and jagged, clutching a briefcase as if it were a life raft. Malik slammed the door of the building, and Jae-hyun knew the clock had just run out. The silent observer was dead. The dragon was awake. "Choi now!" Jae-hyun commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He didn't take the elevator. He moved down the stairs of his own building with a predatory speed that defied his calm exterior. He crossed the street in the pouring rain, his charcoal overcoat fluttering behind him like the wings of a dark bird. By the time he reached the front doors of the Laurent apartment block, the digital locks were already clicking open, overridden by Choi's team. Jae-hyun entered the lobby, but he didn't feel the marble or the gold. He felt the 7 months of silence finally snapping. He reached the 3rd floor and heard it, the sound that ended any remaining shred of mercy in his soul. A crash of glass, a woman's stifled cry, and Malik's voice, high-pitched and hysterical, screaming about betrayal and debts. Jae-hyun didn't knock. He didn't use a key. He placed his hand on the heavy oak door and pushed. The lock, already compromised, gave way with a sickening crack. The apartment was a battlefield of failed luxury. Malik was in the center of the drawing room, his silk shirt stained with sweat, his hair a mess. He was clutching Naomi by the arm, dragging her toward the heavy mahogany desk where a stack of legal documents lay scattered. Naomi was gasping, her hands protectively cradling the massive curve of her stomach, her eyes wide with a terror that had become her only reality. "You signed the papers, Naomi. You signed them." Malik was shrieking, oblivious to the intruder. "If I go down, you go down with me. Your father sold you to me. You are my property." "She is no one's property," Jae-hyun said. The voice didn't roar. It didn't need to. It was the sound of a blade sliding home in the dark. Malik froze. He spun around, his grip on Naomi's arm tightening for a second before the sheer presence of the man in the doorway forced him to let go. Malik stared at Jae-hyun. The impeccable suit, the cold, dark eyes, the aura of a man who dealt in the currency of life and death. To Malik, the covenanted bully, power was something bought with a name and a bank account. To Jae-hyun, power was something etched into his very bones. "Who the hell are you?" Malik gasped, stumbling back against the desk. "This is private property. I'll call the police. I'll have you." Jae-hyun walked into the room. He didn't look at Malik. He looked at Naomi. He saw the way she collapsed against the side of the sofa, her breath coming in ragged, shallow sobs. He saw the red marks on her arm where Malik's fingers had dug in. "Naomi," Jae-hyun said softly. She looked up. For a moment, the fog of her trauma was so thick she didn't seem to recognize him. And then her eyes cleared. The recognition hit her like a physical shock. "Jae? Close your eyes, Naomi," Jae-hyun instructed, his voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Don't look at this. It's almost over. I know who you are." Malik suddenly screamed, his bravado returning in a wave of panicked adrenaline. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small, decorative pistol, a silver-plated toy compared to the reality of the man standing before him. "You're the one, the Korean, the one who ruined my family. You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Jae-hyun finally turned his gaze to Malik. It was like a shutter opening on a furnace. "You have nothing, Malik. Your banks are empty. Your name is a joke in every club from here to Monaco. And you certainly do not have her." Malik leveled the pistol, his hand shaking so violently the barrel traced small, frantic circles in the air. "I'll kill her. I'll kill both of them before I let you have them."
Naomi Laurent.
Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He didn't even slow down. He walked toward the gun as if it were a child's toy. "You are a bully, Malik. You are a man who hides behind a dead father's legacy and beats a pregnant woman because you are too small to face the world. You aren't a husband. You aren't a man. You are a debt that I am here to settle. Stay back," Malik shrieked. Jae-hyun was on him before the man could pull the trigger. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. Jae-hyun's hand shot out, seizing Malik's wrist with the strength of a hydraulic press. There was a sickening pop as the bone shifted, and the silver pistol clattered to the floor. Before Malik could even scream, Jae-hyun's other hand was around his throat, lifting the covenanted bully off his feet and slamming him back against the marble fireplace. The impact shattered the mirror above the mantel, shards of glass raining down like diamonds on the Persian rug. Malik clawed at Jae-hyun's arm, his feet dangling, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. 7 months, Jae-hyun hissed, his face inches from Malik's. 7 months she sat in this room and wondered if she would live to see the sun. 7 months you touched her with hands that should have been broken. You thought I was a ghost, Malik? You thought the east was too far away. Jae-hyun's grip tightened. He could feel the flutter of Malik's pulse, the frantic, weak beat of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. Jae-hyun, stop. Naomi's voice was a broken plea from the floor. The baby. Don't let him see this. Don't become like him. The words hit Jae-hyun harder than any bullet could. He looked back at Naomi. She was trembling, her hands over her stomach, her eyes filled with a desperate need for peace, not just revenge. Jae-hyun looked back at Malik. The man was a pathetic sight, gasping, weeping, his eyes rolling back. He wasn't worth the stain on Jae-hyun's soul. He wasn't worth the memory his son would carry if he were born in a room filled with blood. Jae-hyun let go. Malik collapsed into a heap on the hearth, clutching his throat and retching. Choi, Jae-hyun said, not taking his eyes off the broken man. Secretary Choi stepped into the room, followed by 4 men in black. They moved with the silent efficiency of shadows. Take him, Jae-hyun ordered. The French authorities are waiting downstairs with the embezzlement warrants. Ensure he is processed. Ensure he never, ever sees the sun outside of a barred window. And Choi, make sure his cellmate knows exactly why he's in there. Make sure he knows what happens to men who touch the dragon's heartbeat. The men hauled Malik away. The covenanted bully didn't even go out with a fight. He went out sobbing, calling for a lawyer who would never answer his call. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain against the windows. Jae-hyun stood in the center of the ruined room, the adrenaline slowly receding, replaced by a profound, aching hollow. He turned to Naomi. She was still on the floor, her back against the sofa. He walked to her, dropping to his knees. He didn't touch her at first. He didn't want to startle her. He just stayed there, his heart breaking as he saw the thinness of her face and the way she flinched at the sound of a distant siren. Naomi, he whispered. She looked at him and finally the tears came. Not the tears of terror he had seen through the window, but the tears of a woman who had finally been found. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched his cheek. You're real, she sobbed. I thought I had made you up to stay alive. I thought you were just a dream I had in Seoul. Jae-hyun took her hand, pressing it to his lips. I'm real, and I'm never leaving you again. He looked down at her stomach, the life inside her that had survived 7 months of a nightmare. He placed his hand over hers, feeling the warmth, the defiance of the child. He's strong, Jae-hyun said, his voice thick with emotion. He's a Kang. He has your heart, Naomi whispered. That's why he didn't give up. Jae-hyun stood up, lifting her into his arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who had just dismantled a house. He walked toward the door, leaving the broken glass, the legal papers, and the ghost of Malik Laurent behind. As they stepped into the hallway, Choi was waiting with a medical blanket. Jae-hyun wrapped her in it, shielding her from the cold air of the 7th arrondissement. The car is ready, sir. The medical jet is fueled. We leave for Seoul in 1 hour. Jae-hyun nodded. He walked out of the building and into the rain. He didn't look back at the apartment. He didn't look back at the city. He looked only at the woman in his arms. The silent observer was gone. The extraction was complete. And as the black sedan pulled away from the Rue de Grenelle, the dragon finally felt the weight of the 7 months lift. The war was over. The recovery was beginning. And for the first time in 210 days, Kang Jae-hyun breathed. The transition from the leaden skies of Paris to the shimmering, electric haze of Seoul felt like waking from a fever dream into a world made of light. The private medical jet, a silent silver needle piercing through the clouds of the Eurasian continent, hummed with the steady, reassuring pulse of advanced machinery. Inside the pressurized cabin, the air was filtered, sweetened with the faint scent of sterile linen and the hint of the Korean pine Jae-hyun had ordered to be diffused through the vents. It was the scent of safety. It was the scent of his world. Naomi lay in the center of the cabin's specialized medical suite, her form appearing small and precious against the high-tech white bedding. She was awake now, the sedation having worn off hours over the Sea of Japan, but she remained quiet. Her eyes, still reflecting the shadowed depths of the months she had spent in the 7th arrondissement, were fixed on the window. She watched as the Korean coastline appeared beneath them, a jagged embroidery of dark rock and frothing white surf, eventually giving way to the sprawling, neon-veined organism of Seoul. Jae-hyun had not left her side for a single second of the 11-hour flight. He sat in the chair bolted beside her bed, his charcoal overcoat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful forearms that had, only a day prior, crushed the breath from Malik Laurent's throat. His hand was locked with hers, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles over her knuckles. He was a man who had reclaimed his soul, but the vigilance of the predator remained. He watched her breathing, the monitors, and the slight, restless movements of her stomach with an intensity that suggested he was personally guarding every heartbeat she had left. "We're crossing the Han River," Jae-hyun whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the present. "We'll be at the estate in 20 minutes. The medical wing is ready. The best obstetricians in the country are already waiting. You don't have to be brave anymore, Naomi. You just have to be." Naomi turned her head slowly, her gaze moving from the window to the man beside her. A faint, watery smile touched her lips, the first real glimmer of the woman who had once challenged him to a race through the streets of Gangnam. She squeezed his hand, her grip still frail but intentional. "I don't think I know how to do that yet," she admitted, her voice raspy from months of disuse and tears. "To just be." In Paris, every breath was a calculation. Every silence was a hiding place. "It feels like if I let go, the floor will disappear again." Jae-hyun leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. The heat of his skin was a grounding wire for her drifting spirit. "I am the floor now, Naomi. I am the walls and the ceiling. Nothing reaches you unless it passes through me first. And as we both know, nothing passes through me." The jet touched down at Incheon with a soft, practiced grace. There were no paparazzi, no public spectacle. A fleet of black SUVs waited on the tarmac, their engines idling in a silent, lethal symphony. Secretary Choi stood by the lead vehicle, his posture perfect, his expression a mask of professional satisfaction. The dragon had returned with his treasure, and the syndicate was once again whole. The transit to the Kang estate was a blur of high-speed corridors and private gates. As the gates of the mountain estate swung open, revealing the traditional Hanok-style architecture blended with modern glass and steel, Naomi let out a long, shuddering breath. This was the place where they had spent their last night before she flew to Paris. The cherry blossoms were long gone, replaced by the deep, fiery reds and oranges of a Korean autumn, but the spirit of the place remained unchanged. It was a fortress of peace. She was moved directly to the private medical wing, a suite that felt less like a hospital and more like a sanctuary. Large floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a private koi pond and a grove of ancient maple trees. The equipment was tucked behind elegant wood paneling, and the staff moved like ghosts, silent and deferential. As the doctors performed their initial checks, Jae-hyun stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the lead physician's face. He was looking for even the slightest flicker of concern. "The patient is severely malnourished and shows signs of chronic stress-induced hypertension," the doctor reported quietly to Jae-hyun in the hallway. "But the child is a miracle, Chairman Kang. His heart rate is strong. He is positioned perfectly. He has survived the impossible." He has the constitution of a survivor. Jae-hyun nodded, a tight knot of tension in his chest finally beginning to unravel. Do whatever is necessary. If she wants to sleep, let her sleep. If she wants to scream, let her scream. But ensure that the first thing she sees every time she opens her eyes is me. The days that followed were a slow, agonizingly beautiful process of reconstruction. Jae-hyun moved his office into the room adjacent to her suite. The business of the syndicate, the shipping lines, the tech acquisitions, the cold politics of the Seoul underworld was managed in the margins of his day. His true work was the healing of Naomi Cole. He brought her the things Paris had stolen. He brought her spicy tteokbokki from the street stall she used to love, watching with an ache in his chest as she took her first hesitant bites of flavor after months of Malik's bland, joyless meals. He brought her the books from her old university desk, the ones she hadn't finished. And every night, when the shadows grew long and the memories of the Rue de Grenelle threatened to creep back into her mind, he would sit on the edge of her bed and talk to her. He didn't talk about the syndicate or the war. He talked about the son they were about to have. He'll have your eyes, Jae-hyun said one evening, his hand resting on the high mound of her stomach. The baby kicked, a sharp, energetic thud that made Jae-hyun's eyes light up with a fierce, paternal pride. And he'll have your spirit. He's already proven he can't be broken. Naomi looked down at his hand, then at hers, which was finally regaining some of its warmth and color. I want him to have your strength, Jae. But I want him to use it to build things, not just to protect them. I don't want him to ever know the sound of a fist hitting a wall. I don't want him to know what fear smells like. He won't, Jae-hyun promised, his voice thick with a solemn vow. He will grow up in the light. He will know that the world is a place of neon and possibility, not gray stone and locked doors. I have spent my life making sure the shadows stay where they belong. He is the reason I will make sure they never come near this house again. As she entered her 38th week, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from recovery to anticipation. The nursery was finished, a room of soft blues and natural wood, filled with the best of everything the world could offer. But the most important thing in the room was a small, hand-carved dragon made of dark jade, sitting on the windowsill. It was a guardian for the heir. One night, as a soft rain began to fall over the mountains of Seoul, a rain that sounded nothing like the cold, biting drizzle of Paris, Naomi gripped Jae-hyun's hand with a sudden, sharp intensity. Jae, she whispered, her face pale but her eyes clear. It's time. The medical team moved with practiced precision, but Jae-hyun was the center of her world. He didn't leave her. Through the hours of labor, through the pain that was a different kind of fire than the one she had endured in France, he was her anchor. He whispered the names of the streets they had walked in Seoul. He reminded her of the blue hydrangeas. He told her over and over that the dragon was standing guard. And then, as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the maple trees outside, a new sound filled the room. It was a cry, sharp, loud, and demanding. It was the sound of a debt being paid in full. It was the sound of a bloodline continuing against all odds. The doctor placed the infant in Naomi's arms. He was beautiful, a perfect blend of her warmth and Jae-hyun's sharp, aristocratic features. He was wrapped in a soft silk blanket, his tiny hands clenching at the air, as if already looking for something to hold. Jae-hyun sank to his knees beside the bed. His head bowing as a sob he had held back for 7 months finally broke through his chest. He reached out, his finger trembling as it was caught by the infant's tiny, iron-strong grip. He's here, Naomi whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face, washing away the last traces of the 7th arrondissement. He's home, Jae. Jae-hyun looked at his son, then at the woman who had brought him back from the dead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the blue diamond ring. He didn't say a word as he slipped it onto her finger. Fit perfectly. Welcome to the family, Kang Min-ho, Jae-hyun whispered to the child. The sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the room with a brilliant, golden light. The neon of the city was far away, but here, in the heart of the mountains, the light was pure. The 7 months of hell were a scar, a memory that would fade but never truly vanish. But as Jae-hyun held his wife and his son, he knew that the scar was just a testament to what they had survived. The dragon had gone to the ends of the earth to find his treasure. He had burned down a legacy and built a sanctuary. And as the three of them sat in the quiet of the morning, the silent observer finally found peace. The story that had traveled thousands of miles, from the neon of Seoul to the cold rain of Paris, had finally come full circle. It was no longer a story of loss. It was a story of a return. "We did it," Naomi whispered, her eyes closing in a sleep that was finally truly safe. "We're just getting started," Jae-hyun replied. And outside, the wind moved through the maple trees, a soft, whispering herald of the rain that was to come. The dragon was no longer alone. He had a queen, he had an heir, and he had a world that finally knew better than to ever stand in his way again. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Stories like this mean a lot to me, and I'm so glad I got to share it with you. If you haven't told me yet, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the ride, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.